I'd like to also, as Paul's done, acknowledge the traditional custodians of all of the lands that we're meeting on across Australia today and on all of the Australian campuses of IRU universities, and pay respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Even though I'm presenting from Murdoch, I am presenting on behalf of all of the universities, and I note that both Amanda Martin and Kate Little are here on the call. This was a project that was really designed to give a temperature check of where the IRU universities were in relation to assessment. And it was actually, we began last year, sort of late last year, thinking we were winding things up, but of course we are not. And before I get into the context of it all, I also do want to acknowledge colleagues across the country who are in various states of restriction at the moment and perhaps been working from home from quite some time. I know that it's been a big drain on everybody. So in that context, I guess we're thinking about the ongoing need to be responsive, that the restrictions are likely to be in place for even at least some of next year, particularly in relation to students being able to return from overseas and interstate locations. And I think some of the things that Chris mentioned there about learning remotely really resonate with all of us. We did all move to a variety of emergency remote learning and assessment. The focus for this presentation is really on the assessment component of it and what people did and how that mattered in terms of student success, academic integrity. We were asked to look at things like professional accreditation impacts and how people approached various things. So each university gave a report. Some universities were able to give some data which was comparable to some degree. So I'll try to look at a little bit of that as well. So not all of my slides have got so much writing on them. I think the most significant thing when we looked at the summary of what's changed in relation to assessment design was a move away from a reliance on exams, particularly on face-to-face exams, and then a look towards what could be some other more authentic forms of assessment that could be conducted with students remotely. So there was a wide variety of very creative responses. And if your university was anything like mine, there was a very clear single focus on keeping students learning and making sure that they had access to what they needed as much as possible, that we were responding to them, not just academically, but pastorally and in relation to their enrolment and their circumstances, particularly our international students and other domestic students who didn't have access to any form of additional government funding or supplement to their income, who were really significantly impacted. Many of the universities put temporary waivers in place. They localised change management activities, and then they were overseen centrally, but people were moving at great pace. And I'm sure you were all actually part of that process. There was a lot of professional learning in the thousands of instances in every university. And some things were the professional learning and availability of that was actually taught using the modes that we're asking people to then use with students, whether it's Teams, Zoom, or something else. If you go all the way down to task level, some things worked well and some things didn't. And a lot of that had to do with how much time people had to pivot or change. So if I can give an example from my own university, we were planning to run a face-to-face exam block in our Singapore campus, and with, I think, less than 48 hours notice, we were told, no, we can't do that. So we had to try and pivot really quickly. We learned a lot from that, and then we're able to take that forward into the next offering of assessment activities. We really stopped talking about assessment in terms of exams and started talking about final assessment tasks. And when we get to the point of talking about what's going to stay different, I think that will be one of the things that we'll see shifting across the sector. So exam responses, there was a lot of information about this that people brought up. So I've got a couple of slides on this. And because of the variety of things that were happening across the country, there was a lot of flexibility, a lot of different responses here. So students with identified learning needs or disabilities were dealt with differently. All universities reported that where it was required. Some universities were able to open some limited capacity for students who'd indicated that they didn't have access or useful access to a space or to a computer where they could be able to be quiet, able to engage with an exam situation at home. So there was a whole range of things there. Lots of universities utilised the LMS quiz functionality. Some used it completely for all of the assessment sort of exam type options. Other people used it as a partial response. And I can see that Michael Sankey's online. So I would like to acknowledge the ACode work that was done last year that looked across all universities, not just IRU universities, about their use of proctoring services. So if I drill down then to how the IRU responded, again, there was a range of responses. Some universities already had proctoring tools in place. Other universities rapidly brought them on. Others decided not to use them at all and to come up with another solution. There were a combination of reasons reported, and this is what was reflected in the ACode report as well. There was a cost concern of implementing the service rapidly, concerns about access to required technology while in lockdown, and ensuring students' privacy in their home environment were some of the concerns that people shared. Where people had a more mature approach to proctored or supervised online exams, they were probably in a better position to utilise that technology. So moving on then to graded responses and grading responses. So, and by that, we asked different universities to say, well, what did you do in terms of changing student grades, in terms of giving students an opportunity to select different grades based on their outcome? I think the principle of no disadvantage really guided all universities' decision making around this. And most universities introduced temporary changes with the endorsement of their academic board or equivalent to assessment or grading policy. So, and I think that was a really important thing in terms of being able to quickly respond. These are some of the examples of things that people did. I won't read them all out. Some people have still got these in place. So because we are still seeing this impact. And students at different locations may be feeling it differently depending on where they are physically or whether they are still studying online. So this is across the IRU, the kinds of things that people chose to do. And I think that focus on not disadvantaging students because they were in a major change globally was really the right thing to do. And I'm glad that we had the support of our university senates or equivalent to do that, and good advice from TEXA during that period as well. We didn't ask universities to talk about supporting student learning, but at the same time, people wrote a lot about the human impacts and what they felt they could do as a university to support student learning. So there were a lot of things that talked about mental health and well-being, creating, I guess what Chris talked about, that sense of a digital or online community, people doing online, you know, everyone watched the same movie on Netflix at the same time, but also be logged into an LMS or online yoga or cooking classes or whatever it was that had that sense of community, or even just check-ins and morning teas. Those kinds of things so people could keep those social connections going were probably most prevalent during the first semester, but have continued to some degree. Universities have been checking in with students, doing pulse surveys, the laptop loan or gifting scheme to make sure that students had access to the technology they needed. We know particularly some groups of students are relying on just their phone as their device, and that's not good enough when you're trying to do everything online. Just a couple of shout outs. Western Sydney gave students, this relates to the assessment and grading, but I think also supporting student learning, gave the students the opportunity to do a practice online exam before the final assessment period. And 80% of students who had an online exam took up the practice opportunity. So I thought that was really interesting. At La Trobe, students that were unable to provide the sort of standard evidence-based documentation used a personal declaration form to get an extension or to have changes to their assessment conditions. At our university, no evidence was required for students to gain extensions, etc. And I guess that was because we didn't want to clog up the health system any further. At Griffith, compassionate circumstances broadened to impacts of COVID, including difficulty accessing online resources. So they're just kind of examples of the way that people change their normal boundaries, or universities change their normal boundaries to accommodate student learning. In terms of our staff, down your right-hand side, you'll see the common topics. So these were topics that were run across all of our universities, stood up really quickly, and used in large number. So just really looking at the kinds of fundamental things that needed to occur, that people needed to upskill in order to teach online. So that certainly it's started off with how do I do it, and then a bit more on how do I do it well, and then how will I engage assessment in this new context. So you can see that kind of movement through these professional learning opportunities. As I said, there were a lot of the opportunities were delivered through the web resources, sessions delivered via LMS, Zoom, Teams, individual group consultations, and a lot of shared learning. So universities that have different locations reported one location would be sharing advice, particularly universities with offshore locations, sharing advice between different cohorts of staff about what worked and what didn't. And then lots of what is still growing, I think, websites and repositories to deliver toolkit information in the self-help kind of genre. So I know I'm running out of time, which is why I'm hurrying. Impact on student achievement. These are, I de-identified the universities that submitted this data because that was the basis on which we did it. Basically, what we asked staff to do, or the quality managers to do, was look at pass and progress rates, or student success rates and retention rates over the period. The good news is that in general, success rates remain stable or maybe decline slightly, but were balanced out by those safety net activities that universities engaged in. Retention rate, again, stable. Some slight decline in second semester, and I think you could probably all appreciate students feeling a bit exhausted. And if we're looking back now, I think they're still feeling the same way. So some of the information that sits around that, and this is from our statistical analysis team, having a look at all of the data, saying really there wasn't much that you could really pull out based on the student numbers and the data that was provided. You can, if you think about language and literature, being able to be in person with that, it's probably not much of a surprise. But there weren't really many commonalities or patterns. But I think it's reassuring to know that student achievement didn't take a massive nosedive during the year across any of our universities. When it comes to academic integrity, universities were asked to provide overall figures. What we were really trying to dig into was there a rise, and there was actually quite a sharp rise in reporting, and then cases upheld post-investigation were much lower. So because we were all operating in a new assessment context, the ways that students were behaving, the kinds of assessment we were preparing for students, and the responses to that were, and their understanding of what we were expecting, I guess, were all playing into this almost perfect storm, particularly in first semester last year. The main forms of student misconduct were plagiarism and collusion, use of real-time cheating websites that allowed students to share questions and receive answers, and unauthorised use of materials or devices during the exam. So one of the universities had a high, you can see a massive increase, but actually it was because they'd had a significant drop in cases just prior. So, and then the following year, some balancing out of that, I guess, as we became more skilled at it. So what can we take away from that? Some things, some lessons learned, I guess. Not enough time to transition, awareness about how to design effective online assessments, what was expected or required, and improved, I guess there was an improved detection because the use of electronic assessment tools rather than paper-based assessment means that things were able to be picked up in different ways. I'm just going to be real, I've got 2 more slides to go. Professional accreditation. The commonalities across most professional accreditation bodies was a relaxation around, particularly around invigilated exams, but a focus on whether or not learning outcomes could still be achieved. Most of the professional accrediting bodies didn't expect universities to have changes approved prior, and the most common way of evidencing it was through annual reporting. I think the really important impact to call out here is on things like work integrated learning. So there was some challenges to that. Some cohorts couldn't get out into the places where they would normally be, which leads to a delay potentially in their graduation if they can't get back on track. There was some evidence that work integrated learning opportunities, particularly in health and education, were hampered by changing state-based definitions of essential workers and when they were and weren't allowed to go into workplaces. On the upside, and that's the picture in the background, there was a lot of replacement of face-to-face practicums with simulated learning, telehealth practices, and so on. So quite a lot of work done there. I want to leave a few minutes for questions if I can. So in terms of what's going to change as a result, I hope that we all take the opportunity to pause and think about what are the silver linings here. If you think about what we achieved as a sector under great pressure, there are some silver linings, even though it was very difficult, I think we'd all agree. And there are some pointers to what we can be thinking about for the future. So really thinking about not relying on one form of assessment to the exclusion of all others, to really think about what academic robustness means and what relevance means in terms of future work. And I think what I've seen is a movement from assessment being sort of bolted on to the end of a learning and teaching activity to being much more central to it. And I hope that's something that remains.